In Alabama, a family tragically consumed by the illnesses their own inbreeding created, became one of the most deformed lineages ever documented. Hidden in the secluded valleys and thick forests of Winston County's Appalachian Mountains, a family named the Blackwoods lived, a name that still sends shivers down the spines of locals. The Blackwoods were known not only for their chosen isolation from the rest of the world, but also for the terrible genetic heritage that they passed down through the generations. This is the account of how the mingling of family blood led to the emergence of a lineage so genetically deformed that it became one of the most significant cases in American medical history of the 1950s. The Blackwood family's story emerged in April 1957 when an emergency call brought a rural doctor, Dr. James Harrington, to a remote mountain property. What he discovered would permanently alter his view of the depths of human suffering. On the approximately 40-acre property, around 32 people, all from the same family tree, lived in 3 small wooden houses. "What I saw that day will stay with me for the rest of my life," Dr. Harrington wrote in his medical records, which were later made public after his death in 1983. Children had atrophied limbs, adults had distorted facial features, and a pattern of mental deficiencies appeared in almost all of the family's younger members. The Blackwood property was about 14 miles from the nearest town in Winston County, a place so remote that few people ever visited. Even mail carriers stayed away, leaving correspondence in an improvised box on the main road. Elijah Blackwood, the family's 67-year-old patriarch at the time, was known for his hostility toward outsiders and the strict control he exerted over his relatives. The Blackwoods lived on what they could grow, farming corn, potatoes, and other vegetables on their rocky but fertile land. They raised chickens and pigs, and rarely went into town for essential supplies. The isolation was more than just physical, it was also cultural and genetic. This isolation had started 3 generations before when the first Blackwood came to the area around 1880. Dr. Harrington's visit was to help Martha Blackwood, a 16-year-old girl in a difficult labor. She was both the granddaughter and niece of Elijah, the child of a union between his daughter and his own brother. The infant was born with severe deformities, including polyactyly, extra fingers and toes, microcephaly, an abnormally small head, and congenital heart problems that caused its death just 48 hours later. This tragic event was just the beginning of the discovery of a deeply concerning case of family inbreeding that had gone on for at least 4 generations. The practice of close relative marriages had become an unbreakable tradition among the Blackwoods, which Elijah defended as a way to maintain the purity of the family's blood and protect their lands from outsiders. The initial investigation showed that of the 32 family members, 27 had some type of physical or cognitive abnormality. Among the most common issues were severe facial deformities, including underdeveloped jaws and malformations of the palate, short stature, with adults rarely being taller than 5 feet 3 inches, intellectual disability, from mild to severe, vision problems, including partial or total blindness in about 40% of the family, congenital heart diseases, and limb deformities, such as fused or extra fingers. In his notes, Dr. Harrington described William Blackwood, one of Elijah's sons, who was 42 at the time, as having an asymmetrical face with widely spaced eyes, a very underdeveloped jaw, and an abnormal curvature of the spine that made him look much shorter than he was. His wife, Sarah Blackwood, who was also his first cousin, had coarse facial features with a wide, flat nose, thick lips, and small, deep-set eyes. Of their 6 children, 4 had severe intellectual disabilities and could not even speak in full sentences as adults. According to the doctor's reports, the most unsettling thing was how the family seemed to accept these conditions as normal. "They don't see these deformities as a problem, but as a family characteristic," he wrote. When asked about marriages between close relatives, Elijah responded with a disturbing lack of emotion, saying, "It has always been this way and always will be." If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. These dark stories about isolated communities reveal truths about our humanity that few people have the courage to face. You won't want to miss any of our upcoming cases, which are documented with the same level of detail and care. The story of the Blackwoods gets even darker when we look at how it all began. Historical records show that the first Blackwood to arrive in the region was Isaiah Blackwood, around 1880. He was running from accusations of crimes in Tennessee that were never fully explained. Isaiah, his wife, 2 teenage daughters, and a young son settled in the remote mountains of Winston County, intentionally seeking isolation. A local census from 1890 showed that the family had already grown significantly, with 11 members living on the same property. The records don't explicitly say what later investigations uncovered, that this growth came not just from new members, but from the births of children from relationships within the family itself. Letters found on the property from 1910 show rejected correspondence from distant relatives who tried to stay in touch, with handwritten responses from Isaiah saying, "We don't need anyone. We are self-sufficient and pure. The outside world would only corrupt our lineage." By the third generation, around 1920, the first clear signs of the genetic effects of this practice began to appear. Local medical records, though sparse because the family was reluctant to see doctors, show that children were being born with increasingly severe malformations. Dr. Ernest Miller, a doctor who sometimes handled emergencies in the area in the 1930s, wrote in his personal diary, "I was called to the Blackwood property after a difficult birth. The child had a condition I had never seen before, multiple limb and facial malformations and an almost animal-like behavior from the mother, who refused to let me properly examine the newborn. The child's father, whom I discovered was also the mother's cousin, showed similar signs of unusual facial development." The Great Depression of the 1930s only made the Blackwoods' isolation worse. While many rural Alabama families had to move to cities to find work, the Blackwoods held on even more tightly to their property, surviving by farming and hunting. This time also marked the start of Elijah's leadership, as he took control of the family after his father's death in 1932. Under Elijah's rule, the practice of inbreeding not only continued but was actively encouraged. School records from the area show that the few Blackwood children who attended the county school in the 1940s were taken out after just a few months. A teacher from that time, Mrs. Dorothy Wilkins, wrote in school reports, "The Blackwood children have significant difficulty with learning and socializing. In addition, they have distinct physical features that make them targets of ridicule by their peers." After Elijah Blackwood complained about how his children and nieces and nephews were being treated, the children stopped going to school. The isolation was not just a personal choice, it was also a reaction to growing stigma. People in the area developed an almost superstitious fear of the Blackwoods, and exaggerated stories about their appearance and behavior spread throughout the county. Deformed creatures living in the mountains, or the cursed people of the hills, were common names used to describe the family. A notable event happened in 1945 when 2 young Blackwoods, Joseph and Daniel, who were both cousins and half-brothers, went to town for supplies. Their appearance caused such a stir that frightened customers chased them out of the local grocery store. The local sheriff, Thomas Walsh, recorded the event. "The boys did not act aggressively, just had an extremely unusual appearance, with eyes set very far apart, protruding jaws, and a way of communicating that was almost impossible to understand between them. I had to escort them back to the mountains to prevent more confrontations." This incident only strengthened Elijah's resolve to keep his family completely isolated from the outside world. In the years that followed, between 1945 and 1957, the Blackwoods were rarely seen in town, with the exception of Elijah and his oldest son, Robert, who would occasionally go to buy essential things like salt, ammunition, and tools. World War II, which caused many young men from Alabama to enlist or be drafted, did not directly affect the Blackwoods. No family member served in the armed forces, partly because of their physical and intellectual conditions and partly because they were invisible in official records. Many births and deaths within the family were never officially registered, creating a phantom population that lived on the fringes of American society. It was in this environment of extreme isolation, social stigma, and generations of inbreeding that Dr. Harrington found the family in 1957 when he was called to help with Martha Blackwood's difficult birth. When Dr. James Harrington returned to town after his first encounter with the Blackwoods, he was faced with a difficult ethical and professional choice. As a doctor, he immediately recognized the classic signs of a population with a high rate of consanguinity. But he also knew he was dealing with an extreme case that could greatly add to medical knowledge about the genetic effects of these practices. After quietly consulting with colleagues at the University of Alabama, Harrington got the support of Dr. Walter Thompson, a geneticist who had studied similar, though less severe, cases in isolated communities in Europe. In June 1957, 2 months after the first incident, the two doctors went back to the Blackwood property, this time with a carefully planned strategy. "We couldn't just show up and announce our study intentions," Thompson wrote in his later report. "We approached by offering free medical help and medicines, knowing the family had little to no access to regular healthcare." Elijah Blackwood was initially hostile, but he eventually let the doctors examine some family members, especially after he realized that his granddaughter Martha was still suffering from postpartum complications that were not healing correctly. This small opening allowed the doctors to start what would become one of the first documented studies on the extreme effects of consanguinity in an isolated American population. Over 3 more visits, always under the guise of medical follow-up, the doctors were able to gather important information: a partial medical history of 27 family members, anthropometric measurements of 19 people, photographic documentation, with reluctant permission, of 12 members, and blood samples from 8 people for basic lab tests. The technology of the time did not allow for the advanced genetic tests we have today. But even with basic methods, the results were shocking. Blood analyses showed high levels of homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents, a clear sign of inbreeding. "What we are seeing in the Blackwoods," Dr. Thompson wrote in his 1957 notes, "is a dramatic increase in recessive traits that would normally remain dormant in populations with more genetic diversity. Each generation intensified these traits, causing a domino effect that led to the severe physical and cognitive issues we have documented." Among the specific conditions identified were Apert syndrome, premature fusion of skull bones, in at least 6 members, polyactyly, extra digits, in 11 people, intellectual disability in about 70% of the family, from mild to profound, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, in 8 members, hemophilia in 3 men, and retinitis pigmentosa, progressive retinal degeneration, in almost 40% of the individuals. The study also found a shockingly high infant mortality rate. About 60% of babies born into the family in the last 2 generations did not live past their first year. Those who survived often developed multiple debilitating conditions throughout their childhood. One of the most remarkable cases documented was that of Samuel Blackwood, a 19-year-old son of William and Sarah. The young man had a rare mix of conditions: severe microcephaly, an extremely underdeveloped jaw, multiple extra fingers on both hands, vision limited to seeing light and shadow, and a height of no more than 4 feet 7 inches. Despite these physical limits, Samuel showed surprising musical talent, able to play complex songs on the banjo after hearing them just once. "Cases like Samuel's show the complexity of human genetics," Thompson noted. "Even in conditions of extreme genetic limitation, unique and unexpected characteristics can emerge, reminding us of the unpredictability of gene expression." During one of his visits, Dr. Harrington was able to have a deeper conversation with Abigail Blackwood, 52, Elijah's sister and one of the few family members who had had significant contact with the outside world in her youth. Abigail revealed that as a young woman, she had briefly worked as a domestic servant in Huntsville, but returned to the family property when her father became ill. "They don't know what they are doing to themselves," she confided to the doctor. "I see our children being born weaker and stranger with each generation. I tried to talk to Elijah about bringing new blood into the family, but he says the outside world will corrupt us. He doesn't realize we're withering from within." Have you ever wondered what secrets isolated families hide on their remote properties? Leave a comment with, "The mountains hold truths that society prefers to ignore." Your engagement helps us continue to bring these powerful stories that few have the courage to tell. In August 1957, the doctors presented their initial findings at a small medical conference in Birmingham, keeping the family anonymous for ethical reasons, and only referring to them as Family X from northern Alabama. The presentation generated considerable interest in the regional medical community but also raised ethical questions about intervention. "We are faced with a population that willingly isolated itself and maintains practices that clearly result in physical suffering for future generations," Dr. Thompson argued during the conference. As health professionals, do we have a duty to intervene, or should we respect their cultural autonomy, even when it leads to severe genetic damage? The fall of 1957 was a turning point in the Blackwood story. After the medical conference presentation, the case quietly caught the attention of Alabama's public health authorities. The state health department, concerned about the implications of the case, sent a small, multidisciplinary team to evaluate the situation, including a social worker, a public health nurse, and a legal representative. The arrival of these authorities at the Blackwood property in October 1957 was met with open hostility. Elijah, holding a shotgun, at first refused to let them on his land. Dr. Harrington, who had gained a bit of trust from the family, had to step in to mediate. "You have no right to meddle in how we live," Elijah reportedly shouted at the team. "This is our land, our rules. We've been here for 3 generations, and no one has ever cared about us before." The public health team documented the poor living conditions in the 3 houses on the property: no running water or electricity, rudimentary sanitary facilities that contaminated the family's water well, and general hygiene that made existing health problems worse. 5 school-aged children were not getting any formal education, and several family members had treatable medical conditions that had been ignored for years. The official report, written by social worker Margaret Collins, described, "We found a family living in conditions that are a century behind, both in terms of materials and social practices. The children show clear signs of chronic malnutrition, which worsens the congenital conditions they already have. Several adults suffer from easily treatable diseases, such as severe dental infections and chronic respiratory problems, without any medical help." The situation put the authorities in a difficult position. On one hand, there were clear violations of child welfare and public health laws. On the other, a forced intervention could traumatize an already fragile and isolated community. After long discussions, the health department decided on a slow approach, starting with offers of immediate medical care and education before considering more drastic measures. However, unexpected events sped up the intervention process. In November 1957, a powerful storm hit the area, causing a landslide that partly destroyed one of the houses on the property. 2 family members were seriously hurt and taken to the county hospital, marking the first time many of the younger Blackwoods had left the family's land. This incident gave authorities a chance to intervene more directly. While the injured were being treated, social workers were able to talk with other family members who came with them to the hospital, including 3 teenagers who were curious about the outside world. Rachel Blackwood, 16, who had less severe facial deformities than other family members but had a mild intellectual disability, said she wanted to learn to read properly. "I know I'm different," she told the social worker. "But I want to know what's in books. Dad says we don't need that, but I dream of knowing what is written on the boxes we bring from town." This openness from some of the younger family members, combined with the practical need for help after the landslide, created a crack in the isolation the family had kept for decades. In December 1957, an agreement was reached. The county would provide materials to rebuild the damaged house and ongoing medical assistance in exchange for permission for the school-aged children to receive a basic education from a teacher who would visit the property 3 times a week. Elijah reluctantly agreed, mostly due to pressure from other adult family members who had seen the benefits of contact with the outside world after the landslide. This small compromise marked the start of a slow transformation. The appointed teacher, Esther Jenkins, a 58-year-old experienced educator who had worked with isolated rural communities her whole career, began her visits in January 1958. Her personal diary, later given to the County Historical Archive, offers an intimate look at this process. "My first day with the Blackwood children was a challenge unlike any other in my 30 years of teaching," she wrote. 5 children between 7 and 16 years old, illiterate, all with some degree of cognitive and physical disability. But what struck me most was their hunger for knowledge, an almost desperate hunger for information about a world they had been denied. Little Timothy, 9 years old, with his extra fingers and asymmetrical face, spent almost an hour fascinated with a globe I brought. "Are we really so small in the world?" he asked with wide-eyed wonder. Throughout 1958, the consistent presence of Teacher Jenkins and occasional visits from health professionals began to have a noticeable effect. 3 of the children learned to read at a basic level, chronic medical conditions were treated, and gradually, Elijah's initial hostility lessened, although he still didn't trust the outside world. A major turning point happened in September 1958 when Martha Blackwood, the young woman whose difficult birth had started the whole process, said she wanted to leave the property to get treatment for her ongoing health issues. At 17 years old and now able to read thanks to Mrs. Jenkins's classes, Martha had come to realize that her life could be different. "I don't want anyone else in our family to suffer like we have," Martha told Dr. Harrington during a consultation. "If what you say about our problems coming from marrying relatives is true, then I have to leave here." Martha's decision to leave the property, along with 2 teenage cousins, caused a crisis in the family. Elijah first threatened to use force to stop them, but the intervention of the local sheriff and Dr. Harrington's mediation led to a tense compromise. The young women would be allowed to leave as long as they remained under the supervision of social workers and stayed in regular contact with the family. This event marked the start of the gradual end of the extreme isolation that had defined the Blackwoods for generations. In the years that followed, between 1958 and 1965, more than half of the younger family members chose to leave the property, many seeking medical treatment for their conditions in specialized institutions or integrating, as much as possible, into wider society. The early 1960s saw profound changes in the Blackwoods' history. The property, which had been a secluded stronghold for almost 80 years, slowly began to open up to the outside world. Elijah Blackwood, the unbending patriarch, had to face not only the loss of his absolute authority but also a reality that contradicted everything he had believed for decades. In January 1962, Elijah suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and in need of care, a situation that was ironically symbolic for a man who had valued independence and isolation so much. Cared for by his sister Abigail and with regular medical help now available, he lived 5 more years, passing away in 1967 at the age of 77. During these final years, Elijah watched changes that he likely saw as the destruction of his way of life. William, his eldest son, took over as the family's leader, and influenced by the new ideas brought by health professionals and educators, he began to make significant changes to the property. The main house was renovated with social assistance funds, getting basic plumbing and electricity in 1963. An improved access road was built the same year, allowing vehicles to reach the property even in heavy rain. The younger children began attending the local school, though they received special support for their specific needs. Dr. Walter Thompson, who had started his studies with the family in 1957, continued to follow the Blackwoods case for more than 2 decades. In 1972, he published a landmark article in the American Journal of Human Genetics titled, Multigenerational Effects of Consanguinity in Isolated Populations, a case study from rural Alabama. The article, which used the pseudonym Alpha Family to keep the family anonymous, carefully documented the genetic effects seen over 5 generations. Thompson's work became a key reference in population genetics, greatly contributing to the scientific understanding of the effects of long-term inbreeding in human populations. Among his most important findings were, the increasingly severe expression of recessive genetic conditions with each generation, the appearance of rare combinations of conditions that are seldom seen in more genetically diverse populations, a sharp drop in fertility and birth viability in recent generations, and the emergence of unexpected traits in some individuals, such as specific talents amid widespread disabilities. The study also documented the improved general health and development of the younger family members after the 1957-58 intervention. Children who received proper nutrition, medical care, and education showed better cognitive and physical development compared to their older siblings and cousins, showing the powerful impact of environmental factors even in cases with a strong genetic predisposition. A particularly notable part of the study was the follow-up of the young women who left the property in 1958. Martha Blackwood, whose difficult birth experience had started the entire process, eventually settled in Birmingham, where she got treatment for her medical conditions and learned basic sewing skills. Although she was never able to live completely independently due to her limitations, she found purpose working in a craft program for people with disabilities. In a 1975 interview with a local newspaper, Martha, then 34, reflected on her journey. "I was born in a place where we didn't know there was another way to live. We thought we were as we were meant to be. Now I understand that much of our suffering could have been avoided. I don't blame my parents or grandparents. They did what they thought was right. But I'm glad our story can help other people understand the risks of this kind of isolation." Other Blackwood children and young adults who received educational and medical help had various outcomes. Some with more severe disabilities were eventually placed in specialized institutions as their family caregivers aged. Others achieved surprising levels of social integration, especially those who had been exposed to education earlier. The population of the Blackwood property gradually decreased. Of the 32 family members who lived there when Dr. Harrington made his first visit in 1957, only 12 remained in 1975. The land, which had been kept isolated for so long, was partly sold to neighboring farmers, with a small central portion still occupied by descendants of the family. The Blackwoods case had an impact beyond the immediate family. In the 1970s, it influenced public health policies in rural areas of Alabama, with specific programs being created to find and help isolated communities. Health professionals were trained to recognize signs of consanguinity and to address the issue in a culturally sensitive way with affected communities. In medical schools across the southern United States, the Blackwood case study, always presented with pseudonyms, became part of the medical genetics curriculum, dramatically showing the risks of prolonged inbreeding. Dr. Thompson often said that the Blackwood story was both a lesson in genetics and a lesson in humility for medicine, a reminder that entire communities can exist on the fringes of our health systems, facing suffering that could be eased with proper intervention. In 1980, a team of documentarians from the University of Alabama received permission from William Blackwood, then 65 and the last of Elijah's children still living, to create a historical and educational record about the family. The documentary, titled Isolation in the Mountains, A Story of Rural Alabama, was produced with care, keeping the family's anonymity and focusing on the medical and social aspects of the case rather than sensationalizing the physical deformities. The film, which was only shown in educational and medical settings, included interviews with professionals who worked with the family and some family members who agreed to participate. One of the most articulate participants was Rachel Blackwood, then 39, who had become an informal advocate for the rights of people with disabilities in her community. "People look at families like ours and see only the strange, the different," she said on camera, her face with distinctive features but undeniable dignity. "They don't see the real people behind the appearances. Each of us has a story, dreams, and fears. What happened to our family is a tragedy that could have been prevented with knowledge and support. I hope others can learn from our experience." The Blackwoods' genetic legacy continued, though in a more diluted form, in later generations. The younger members who left the property and eventually started their own families did so with unrelated partners, leading to a quick drop in the number of severe deformities in just one generation. A follow-up study conducted by Dr. Thompson in 1985, just before he retired, documented 43 direct descendants of the Blackwoods living in various parts of Alabama. Of these, about 30% had mild to moderate genetic conditions, a sharp decrease compared to the almost 85% seen in the previous generation. The case of the Blackwoods, Thompson wrote in his final conclusions, shows both the fragility and resilience of the human genome. In just one generation of genetic diversification, we saw significant improvements in the health and development of their descendants. However, certain conditions remain, reminding us of the lasting impact that inbreeding can have across generations. The original Blackwood property, reduced to less than 10 acres, was lived on until 1992 when the last resident, Thomas Blackwood, Elijah's great-nephew, passed away at 62. The land was sold, and the original structures, which had been damaged by time, were eventually torn down. Today, few physical signs remain of the place that was home to one of the most well-documented stories of family inbreeding in the United States. Visiting the site where the Blackwood property once stood today is a quiet experience. The mountains and forests are unaffected by the human drama that unfolded there for decades. A small plaque placed by local historians in 2005 marks the site with a simple message: on this site lived a family whose experiences significantly contributed to the medical understanding of genetic isolation and the importance of human diversity. The last known Blackwood descendants are now scattered, many having taken new last names and integrated into communities where their family history is unknown. Some have stayed in touch with each other, connected by family ties and shared experiences that few outsiders could ever fully understand. In 2007, on the 50th anniversary of Dr. Harrington's initial discovery of the family, the University of Alabama School of Medicine held a symposium on genetic isolation and public health, lessons learned and future challenges. One of the speakers was Michael Thompson, Dr. Walter Thompson's son and also a geneticist, who had inherited his father's research files. The Blackwoods case is not just a medical history, he said during the event. It's a study of how isolation, geographic, social, and genetic, can shape human destinies. It's also a story of how compassionate intervention can change paths that seemed unavoidable. 50 years later, we are still learning valuable lessons from this remarkable family.